Hey everybody. Um, this is a section from Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism and the Soviet Union. It's about the Trotsky's theory of the degenerated worker state. This is not the only place in the book where this theory is discussed. So I'll probably have another video about where it's mentioned in other books. But this particular section is from the chapter 3 of the book, which is titled, From Stalin's, quote, Great Leap Forwards, end quote, to the, quote, Great Patriotic War, 1929 to 41. And if you don't know what this book is, it's a history of critical left approaches to the Soviet Union. Yeah. So that would include people like, left communists, Trotskyists, left socialists, various people, some Frankfurt School people, Wittfogel, Pollock, that kind of thing. Anyway, I'm going to start. A completely novel theory, Trotsky, the theory of the degenerated worker state. A completely novel theory was developed by Leon Trotsky. Trotsky's learning process with respect to developments in the Soviet Union was extraordinarily complex. From his numerous writings, it is clear that, notwithstanding the many contradictions and ambivalences which can be identified in Trotsky's ideas, he maintained one unitary form of reasoning throughout the whole period as the core of his thought. The reasoning can be formalized as follows. A. The achievements of a necessarily violent social revolution could only be annulled by a necessarily violent counter-revolution. B. The October Revolution was a violent social proletarian revolution which resulted in a workers' state. From A and B, it followed that C. So long as no violent counter-revolution has occurred, it remained necessary to characterize the Soviet Union as a workers' state. Some footnotes. Footnote 1. Lev Bronstein, 1879 to 1940, alias Lev D. Trotsky, Russian socialist, played an important role in the revolution of 1905 as leader of the St. Petersburg Soviet. He led from 1913 the Mezryantsy, a group of social democrats who wanted to reunite the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. He joined the Bolsheviks in July 1917, became chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, and led the Military Revolutionary Committee which coordinated the October insurrection. From 1918 until 1925, Trotsky was People's Commissar of War. In the 1920s, Trotsky played a prominent role in the anti-Stalinist opposition. He was expelled from the party in 1927 and in 1929 exiled from Russia. In 1938, Trotsky founded the Fourth International. In 1940, Trotsky was assassinated by an agent of Stalin. The standard biography is Deutscher, 1954, 1959, and 1963. What's it, I forget all the titles. Prophet Betrayed, Prophet Armed, Prophet Outcast, and what? What's the other one? Can't remember. I haven't read them, so can't comment on that. Hi, Eddie. It's my brother's dog. You good boy. You nice doggy. The next footnote says, a number of changes and contradictions in Trotsky's thinking are analyzed in McNeill, 1977, especially pages 31 to 33. End footnote. All the phenomenon of bureaucratization and degeneration were fitted by Trotsky into continually changing theoretical frameworks, which had these assumptions as their unchanging core idea. In order to sustain this interpretation when the dictatorship of the bureaucratic elite became increasingly one of terror, Trotsky had to adapt the content of his political categories to the evolving political circumstances. Given that the, quote, workers' state, end quote, for Trotsky was primarily another word for, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, and the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, for Trotsky ultimately meant the same as, quote, workers' democracy, end quote, Trotsky at first could not conceive of a workers' state which did not, at the very least potentially, hold political power. As late as 1931, Trotsky declared, quote, in the working class, the tradition of the October overthrow is alive and strong. Firmly rooted are the habits of class thought. Unforgotten in the older generations are the lessons of the revolutionary struggles and the conclusions of Bolshevik strategy. In the masses of the people, and especially in the proletariat, lives the hatred against the former ruling classes and their parties. All these tendencies in their entirety constitute not only the reserve of the future, but also the living power of today, which preserves the Soviet Union as a workers' state. ... This is in italics. The recognition of the present Soviet state as a workers' state not only signifies that the bourgeoisie can conquer power only by means of an armed uprising, but also that the proletariat of the USSR has not forfeited the possibility of subordinating the bureaucracy to it, of reviving the party again, and of regenerating the regime of the dictatorship without a new revolution, with the methods and on the road of reform, end quote. Trotsky. With this, quote, reformist perspective in mind, Trotsky for many years refused to write off the communist parties in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. It was also for this reason that he distanced himself from like-minded spirits who ventured to organize outside of the Comintern. Footnote. One thinks of Trotsky's criticism of his co-thinkers Rosmer and Monat, who wanted to form their own organization. See Trotsky, 1925. Typical also is the following statement from an interview in 1929. Quote, the talk of a fourth international which I am supposed to be founding is utter rubbish. The Social Democratic International and the Communist International both have deep historical roots. No intermediate, 2.5, or additional, fourth internationals are required, end quote. Trotsky, 1929. That interview, I think, is with a magazine from Japan, a newspaper from Japan. It's on the this YouTube channel. Yes, back to the text. End footnote. After Hitler's conquest of power in 1933, an event which the German communists watched rather powerlessly, Trotsky gradually abandoned his idea that party and state could still be reformed. Footnote. Trotsky justified these changes in his position by reasoning by analogy. Just as in the French Revolution, a, quote, thermidor, end quote, would have occurred, which resulted in a, quote, Bonapartist, end quote, regime. See on this analogy Law, 1982, Bergman, 1987, especially pages 83 to 98, and Kalos, 1989. End footnote. But in so doing, Trotsky created a problem for himself. On the one hand, Trotsky had argued that the absence of a violent counter-revolution, quote, proved, end quote, that the Soviet Union was still a worker state. But, on the other hand, reform of the regime was now no longer possible, and therefore a new revolution was on the historical agenda. To clear away this obvious inconsistency, Trotsky seems to have resorted to Kautsky's old distinction between a political and economic revolution. Trotsky reasoned that, because a worker state had already been established in the USSR, only a political revolution was necessary in the future, which had to clear away the obstacles restricting the free functioning and further development of the planned economy. Quote, essentially in Russia, it is in the first instance not a question of social revolution, not about the conquest of political power by one of the subordinate classes of society to clear the way for a new mode of production, but about a political revolution, about clearing away the political obstacles which hinder the free functioning of an already existing mode of production." End quote. Kautsky, 1904-5. End footnote. In 1936, Trotsky completed the manuscript for his book, What is the Soviet Union and Where is it Going?, which in the following years appeared in several countries, in translations such as La Révolution Trahie, The Revolution Betrayed, and Feretena Revolution, or Feretena Revolution. I don't know. Footnote. The original manuscript in Russian is held in the Trotsky archives at Harvard. In this work, which since that time has remained an important, sometimes negative, sometimes positive point of reference, Trotsky adhered to the concept of a workers' state. At the same time, Trotsky sought to integrate the phenomenon of bureaucratization into his theory. Just like before, Trotsky's point of departure was that the Soviet regime, with its contradictions, could not be defined as socialist, but was, quote, a preparatory regime, transitional from capitalism to socialism, end quote. This then explained why the Soviet state possessed a dual character, quote, socialistic, insofar as it defends social property in the means of production, bourgeois, insofar as the distribution of life goods is carried out with a capitalistic measure of value, and all consequences ensuing therefrom, end quote. Trotsky, 1937. Because socialist characteristics dominate in the sphere of production, state monopoly of foreign trade, nationalization of industry, planned economy, and because that was the only reason why it still made sense to speak of a workers' state, the roots of bureaucracy could, by definition, not be located within this productive sphere. They had to be found in the sphere of distribution, where scarcity and thus bourgeois norms of distribution prevailed. Quote, the basis for bureaucratic rule is the poverty of society and objects of consumption, with the resulting struggle of each against all. When there is enough goods in a store, the purchasers can come whenever they want to. When there are too few goods, the purchasers are compelled to stand in line. When the lines are very long, it is necessary to appoint a policeman to keep order, such is the starting point of the Soviet bureaucracy. It, quote, knows, end quote, who is to get something and who has to wait. End quote, Trotsky. To the extent that the productive forces were less developed in a post-revolutionary country, the social weight of bureaucracy would naturally be greater there. It stood to reason that the bureaucracy would therefore appropriate special privileges. Quote, nobody who has wealth to distribute ever omits himself. Thus, out of a social necessity, there is developed an organ which has far outgrown its socially necessary function, and become an independent factor, and therewith the source of great danger for the whole organism, end quote. In no other historical situation did the bureaucracy, which Trotsky sometimes refers to as a, quote, caste, end quote, and at other times as a, quote, social stratum, end quote, acquire such a degree of independence from the ruling class, the proletariat. Even Lenin would, if he had lived longer, only have been able to break the degeneration, but no more. B-R-A-K-E, break. In brief, quote, the leaden rump of the bureaucracy outweighed the head of the revolution, end quote. Trotsky. Possibly, Trotsky himself sensed that there was something artificial about his argument. It had always been axiomatic for him that planned economy and workers' democracy necessarily had to go hand in hand. The one could not be maintained without the other, because only in a democracy would trustworthy information and optimal effort from all concerned be guaranteed. This explains why he built a temporal perspective into his theory. A degenerated worker state, such as described in The Revolution Betrayed, cannot possibly last for a long time. In 1938, Trotsky noted, quote, democracy, is the one and only conceivable mechanism for preparing the socialist system of economy and realizing it in life, What the lexicon of Stalin's justice designates as, quote, sabotage, end quote, is in reality one of the evil consequences of bureaucratic methods of domineering. The manifestations of disproportion, wastefulness, and entanglement, constantly increasing, threaten to undermine the very foundations of planned economy. End quote. Not long before writing this, Trotsky had already warned, quote, that which was a, quote, bureaucratic deformation, end quote, is at the present moment preparing to devour the workers' state, without leaving any remains. If the proletariat drives out the Soviet bureaucracy in time, then it will still find the nationalized means of production and the basic elements of the planned economy after its victory, end quote. Trotsky. The bureaucratic degeneration was, for Trotsky, fundamentally a phenomenon of short duration. Quote, for Trotsky, end quote, as Pierre Frank correctly noted, quote, Stalinism was an accident, not a durable creation of history, end quote. Hence Trotsky's use of imagery referring to the bureaucracy as a, quote, stillborn child, end quote, or as a, quote, cancerous growth, end quote, that could and should be surgically removed, or Trotsky's comparison of the USSR with a car that, although it had crashed, would be able to drive away again after being fixed by a mechanic. Trotsky, 1939. This perception of historical time is almost always overlooked in commentaries on Trotsky. It is doubtful whether the temporal limit can be explained mainly as the product of a personal psychology of Trotsky himself, as Fritz Sternberg suggested. Footnote. Quote, for Trotsky, recent events in Russia were no longer to be analyzed objectively, but had become components in a personal equation designed to answer the question, shall I, Trotsky, return to Russia as I did in 1905 and 1917, and shall I become the leader of a new anti-Stalinist revolution? This personal equation underlays everything he said, even though he never, of course, expressed it in so many words, end quote. End footnote. End quote. Sternberg. End footnote. A more plausible interpretation is that it was a direct result of Trotsky's conviction that planned economy and bureaucratic dictatorship were fundamentally incompatible. In this context, it is also important to consider Trotsky's overall assessment of the international situation. For Trotsky, capitalism had entered its final phase when he founded the Fourth International in 1938 and bequeathed this organization with a, quote, transitional program for socialist revolution, end quote. This political document was titled The Death Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International. The long phase of economic downturn affecting the capitalist system meant for Trotsky that the productive forces could no longer grow. The system as a whole had stagnated, and had begun to show more and more barbaric and primitive characteristics. Quote, mankind's productive forces stagnate. Already new inventions and improvements fail to raise the level of material wealth. The bourgeois itself sees no way out. The decay of capitalism continues under the sign of the Phrygian cap in France, as under the sign of the swastika in Germany. Nothing short of the overthrow of the bourgeoisie can open a road out, end quote. The Soviet Union, which showed rapid economic development despite Stalinist dictatorship, appeared in a clear positive contrast with this picture of general social decay. The distinction between a developing and a decaying society was, for Trotsky, also the ultimate foundation of his appeal to defend the Soviet Union unconditionally, in the event of armed conflicts with capitalist countries. The world situation was, in Trotsky's eyes, so unstable at the end of the 1930s that, with a new world war looming ahead, the existence of both capitalism and the Stalinist bureaucracy would be challenged by a forward-storming proletarian revolution. Only workers' power still had a future, in the short term. In 1938, Trotsky expressed his prognosis accordingly in the following way, quote, if this war provokes, as we firmly believe, a proletarian revolution, it must inevitably lead to the overthrow of the bureaucracy in the USSR and regeneration of Soviet democracy on a far higher economic and cultural basis than in 1918. ... If, however, it is conceded that the present war will provoke not revolution but a decline of the proletariat, then there remains another alternative, the further decay of monopoly capitalism, its further fusion with the state and the replacement of democracy wherever it is still remained by a totalitarian regime." End quote. The Soviet bureaucracy would in that case be able to transform itself into a new exploiting class, which would reflect the eclipse of, quote, the quote, eclipse of civilization, end quote. In this way, Trotsky translated the old adage, quote, socialism or barbarism, end quote, as though it concerned two short-term alternatives, a third, intermediate route, along which the proletariat would not achieve world revolution, and in which both the structures of the Soviet Union and those of capitalism would remain intact in their essentials, was a prospect he could not envisage. The end.